Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our latest TBI talk. My name is Jeegar Kakkad. I'm Head of Productivity and Innovation at the Tony Blair Institute. Our topic today is our new report called Anywhere Jobs, which looks at the mass experiment in remote work and what it means for people. Because if a job can be done fully remotely from home, then it could potentially be done from anywhere in the world, most likely for cheaper. And we call these what we find are largely white collar roles that are vulnerable to outsourcing and offshoring anywhere jobs. To help us discuss these trends and how technology is making labor more flexible, more mobile, more global, we have three very distinguished guests, which I'm very happy to welcome. Our first panelist will be Richard Baldwin. He is Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. And his 2018 book, The Globalisation of Upheaval, heavily influenced the thinking behind this report. Second, we have Dr. Janine Berg, who is a senior economist at the International Labor Organization. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Reynold, MP. He's the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary and is a Member of Parliament for Stalybridge and Hyde since 2010. A little bit of housekeeping. For those that have joined us today, there is the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen you will all be fully familiar with. If there are any questions that occur to you during the discussion and you would like us to put them to the panel, please do put them in that Q&A box and we will get to them as many as we can. Put them in there and I'll be the one reading them out, putting them to the panelists and getting the responses. Right, so to start us off, I'm going to do a quick run through, a quick presentation overview of our Anywhere Jobs report to just bring everyone up to speed on what we did, why we did, and why we think this actually matters to the UK. So Anywhere Jobs, reshaping the geography of work. I think the first thing to say is what we're looking at is what changes remote working during the pandemic meant for what were typically knowledge workers, office-based workers. We know there's a whole swathe of frontline workers that were affected during the pandemic. But in this report, we wanted to focus primarily on what was happening to those knowledge workers because we think there's a significant change in the way in which they were working that has longer term consequences. And the first issue that we found, we wanted to look at, what were the very nature of tasks and work that was being done remotely that could mean a job could be done from anywhere. So we use a very large US database to look at the tasks and activities inherent in different types of jobs. And what we found is that there are three different types of activities that make anywhere jobs different. I mean, these jobs can be done from anywhere. The first was that it had limited physical activity, typically work that's done at a computer, at a desk. There's a degree of creativity, of knowledge, of special technical knowledge that goes into it, but limited physical activity. It involves asynchronous and detailed tasks. The work doesn't have to be done at the same time as colleagues. It can be done independently whenever you want to, kind of as a kind of ad hoc project on the side. And what that means is the work tends to be relatively peripheral to the core of the business. Meaning there are limited levels of responsibility, limited levels of decision-making, and limited commercial responsibility and outcomes from these jobs. When we're looking at these different types of jobs, what we found is around 18% of all jobs across the UK met these criteria. Roughly 5.9 million jobs, mainly in tech, finance, professional services, typically done by typically younger people, definitely well educated and living in London in the southeast. And we also found these jobs tend to be grouped in kind of three different broad buckets. In the first bucket, you have very numerical, quantitative type roles: accountants, economists, insurance underwriters. The second bucket is definitely more tech focused. IT support, software programmers, coders, and certain classes of engineers. And the third bucket is graphic designers, marketing and advertising execs, web design and development. As I said, anywhere jobs tend to be based in London and the southeast, but they really are everywhere. Just by the nature of these works, these are what we call it professional jobs. They tend to be, they're in every single region, tend to be concentrated in London and the southeast. One of the things that we found is that percentage of individuals in anywhere jobs, they tend to be relatively better paid. So as historically the jobs that would have been vulnerable to outsourcing and offshoring, to automation, would have been the moderately skilled jobs, the jobs in the middle of the earnings deciles. What we find here is it tends to be higher paid jobs that are now vulnerable to outsourcing and offshoring. And what this tells us, and we won't go into the detail here, but these workers are therefore relatively more educated, relatively highly skilled, and as I said, tend to be a little bit younger on average. I think one thing where it pains to stress in the report is not all these jobs will move abroad. The example I like to give is one of the jobs, anywhere jobs, is a financial controller. And a financial controller for a multinational reinsurance company based in the city of London, their job might be slightly more vulnerable to outsourcing or offshoring than a financial controller for a small precision engineering company in Market Bosworth in the Midlands. So they're both doing an anywhere job, but one is slightly more vulnerable. The contextual factors means that job is slightly more vulnerable. And we found a range of these contextual factors, we call them anchors and accelerants, that would determine whether a job would stay or whether it would go. And these are a range of things: availability and ease of support systems. This is everything from childcare and connectivity to the tax system and regulation, and the ease of navigating those systems. It's access to or otherwise shortages of skilled workers, whether a company's interest in productivity is about well-being or is it about cutting costs and saving money and therefore outsourcing workers. It's partly about strengths of links to local communities, language and culture, kind of social capital factors that might anchor a community within the UK and therefore the jobs in the UK. Or the company or the sector's mode of competition and operation. Are they looking, do they need to scale very quickly to beat the competition? Therefore, they might be more interested in outsourcing or unbundling parts of their services. So these range of contextual factors that might mean whether a job stays or goes. And what we think this means is given the scale of the number of jobs that we're talking about, 6 million highly skilled white-collar professional jobs at risk of being outsourced or offshored, we think the UK needs to adapt so that it can take advantage of this increase in remote work. Because historically, it was moderately skilled, routine manufacturing jobs that were vulnerable, and highly skilled professional jobs thrived. Now the pandemic has changed all that, and what we see is wide-scale remote work has made non-routine professional jobs vulnerable to outsourcing and offshoring. And I think the UK can partly mitigate this, but also make it as attractive as possible for remote workers through 3 steps. The first is strengthening that support infrastructure. Again, here we're talking about childcare, childcare as infrastructure, having access to suitable housing and workspace, having access to connectivity across the UK. And again, the ease of navigating the tax system, the ID systems, the regulatory systems, the employment systems. We're also thinking about designing new forms of skills and retraining. Typically, it's going to be the softer interpersonal, sometimes called the non-cognitive leadership type skills that are really going to matter in the future. So can we make sure anywhere workers have these types of skills? And I think the last thing that we're pointing to, and again, this is not new, but definitely still hasn't been done, is renewing the social contract to reflect a more flexible, more mobile, more global labor market, and reflect the changes individual workers are going to likely go through their lifetime. So that's just a quick canter through the report. I would really recommend everyone digging into the full report. It is hopefully highly readable, and there's Twitter threads and Instagram feeds, stories on the main messages of the report. What I will do now is hand over to Richard. If you want to make the first comments, thoughts, introductions. As I said, your book, The Globalisation Upheaval, heavily influenced our thinking. So really grateful for you to be here and love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Jeegar, also for calling out my book, which I just happen to have a copy of right here. First chapter's free to read on Google, just in case you want to know. This is a great report, a very important report, I think. I think a lot of people have not understood how digital technology is changing the reality of work in offices. I think it's happening faster than most people believe and in ways few people expect. And I think a report like this is a wake-up call. It's a brave attempt, I think, at quantifying it, but that's important just to get people to dial into how many jobs here we're talking about. And I think your numbers are relatively conservative, which I'll talk about in a second. So first of all, these calculations are tricky. Of course, I have to criticize it a little bit because it's based on a status quo. And digital technology is rapidly eroding that status quo. All of us have jobs that are work in progress in the service sector. What is the to-do list of your job is changing rapidly. If you look at what you had to do 10 years ago and what you're doing now, it's changed. Now, what a lot of this will do is change the list of tasks that you have to do now in the office and have some of those offshored. So I think an important perspective, which doesn't come through perhaps as strongly as it could in the report, is that we're really talking about individual tasks that will change everybody's job as they're offshored to cheaper locations. So I think when you just count the number of heads, you're underestimating how transformative this thing will be. The second thing is COVID, and you talk about it, but COVID really has done three big things. One, it has systematically made remote workers less remote. Our companies have learned to manage remote teams. The customers, the service customers have learned how to receive the output remotely, how to manage. Our companies have set up information systems. Everybody's learned how to do Zoom, more or less. And that is not going back. But really, all that happened was COVID was like a conductor who moved the entire workforce to the frontier of remote work. And that has completely changed things in just a few months. Imagine how digital technology will improve and change things. It's getting twice as good every 2 years. The second thing is it's made office space more expensive. And eventually we'll go back to normal, but at least in the transition, which is when the economic reprise, the economic coming back up will happen, and companies are deciding whether to hire remote or whether local, office space is more expensive. So that will shift that. And the last thing is that a lot of people have already been separated from their job, and it's much harder to rehire than it is to fire. And since a lot of people have been let go, they really had a much different thing. So that's, I'd like to point out that I think there's some important elements that are going to accelerate. The other thing is just starting to dawn on companies that £5 an hour is a middle-class living in most countries in the world, including people who have university degrees from the same universities that we have, but living in Manila. If a couple each earns £5 an hour, that puts them in the upper middle income of Philippines, for example. And that will allow lots and lots of substitution of many, many tasks. Now I'm gonna try and cut, I have lots more to say, but let me just try and put it down to a couple things. First of all, I think the upheaval part that you talk about is important, because these workers have not experienced globalization, and the vast majority of people are thinking about globalization as it has been for the last 2.5 years, when it was a problem of people who worked in manufacturing, mining, or on farms. It was their problem. Now it's coming to the offices, and in some sense, in the way that factories were unbundled with stages put abroad to lower wage countries, but with the technology moving with them. That same thing is happening to the offices now. The offices are unbundling. And it goes not just globalization, as you mentioned a little bit. The digital technology is allowing a destruction of the classic employer-employee relationship, moving towards a gig economy, which is all part of this, and putting a degree of precarity on work, which needs to be dealt with. And in fact, I think we should have a new form of unemployment, a new definition, which is a precarious unemployment, not just hours, not just income, but how uncertain it is. Can you take a holiday? What happens when you want maternity leave? Can you plan ahead for bringing your kids to school, or do you always have to be available? So I'm going to stop right there. I think this is a tremendous report, and it's beginning of a conversation. Hopefully it'll spark a lot more reflection, a lot more research. But bravo for having done it, and thanks for having me here to share my thoughts. I'll come back in Q&A if somebody's interested.
Richard, I'm just going to follow up with one quick question. You described the process of unbundling and manufacturing, the kind of disaggregation of value chains, and that happened over a period of 30 or 40 years as national value chains were disaggregated and became global. Over what kind of time frame are we looking at this unbundling happening in services and remote work, work going from the office place to being anywhere in the world? What kind of time frame are we looking at? Is it 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, or is it happening now?
Well, I'm an economist. Sorry about that. Somebody has to be. But one of the things we learn in graduate school is give a number or give a date, never both when making a forecast. So there's no doubt that in 5 years, work in cities like London will have been completely transformed by this, partly by offshoring things or regionalizing things to cheaper areas within the country where cultural and linguistic and occasional face-to-face matters, but also finding out that you can get some incredibly talented people for much cheaper and with machine translation in countries that are unexpected. So I think in 5 years, it'll be completely transformed. And I used to be a little nervous about saying 5 years, but I've seen how much happened in the last 18 months. It's amazing. And all that happened was a coordination push. There was really very little new technology. And people are reacting with, moving to places that are cheaper. And that trend, both on the worker side and the employer side, that I think is going to catch on and start a snowball effect. Whereas if, say, you're doing insurance and you can get your back office stuff done for cheaper, that will put you in a more competitive position. And then all the other insurance companies will have to do the same thing. So I think this competition race to the bottom of costs, that could accelerate it. But 5 years, I think it'll be fundamentally transformational. I think none of our jobs will be the same in 5 years because of this telemigration, as I call it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Berg, over to you for your comments and thoughts.
Okay, great. So thanks for the invitation and thanks for allowing me to read your report, which is really interesting. So I'm going to structure my comments around kind of two themes that are in your report that are obviously related, but a little bit different. So one is the move towards remote work that we've seen during the COVID pandemic. And the other one is the move of jobs out of the UK, what Richard calls telemigration, but what I always refer to as virtual outsourcing. So they're related, but they're a little bit distinct. So let me start with the policy recommendations that you've made for infrastructure, childcare, skills training. All of these things are really important for the topic of remote work. I mean, I think this is something that all governments should be investing in. It's not just important for remote work; it's actually important for all types of work, and it's important also for gender equality. I mean, unless you have gender equality at the home, you don't have gender equality in the workplace. So, if that is a goal, that is something that we should all be investing in. Now, with remote work, there are some of the issues that we've seen. So we actually started a study before the COVID pandemic hit on working from home. And in that study, we looked at different countries around the world use their labor force survey data to calculate what we call wage penalties. So basically you take two identical workers, one working from home, one working in an office or a factory, but the same skill level, same occupation, same sector, and you compare their salaries. And what we found was that in the UK, when we use the UK labor force survey data, there was a wage penalty of 13%. So this is some of the risk of just working completely remotely from home. You can be forgotten by the enterprise. Eventually, over time, you can have a wage penalty. There isn't much career progression. Again, with the issue of gender equality, we see that many more women are interested in working from home because it's a way for them to combine it with family responsibilities. This has a risk of retraditionalizing gender norms. So these are some of the things that we need to think about. In general, what is better is to have some sort of hybrid model where people come in or have some sort of contact with the office where they come in maybe 1 to 2 times a week or at least a few times during the month so that there is less of this risk of wage penalties and career progression and also less of a risk of gender inequalities. So that's one issue. Now, let me turn a little bit to the topic of virtual outsourcing. Now, I agree very much with Richard on the prognosis for change and how changes happen so quickly. I would actually say that it already was happening before the pandemic. The pandemic is just speeding things up. We did studies before the pandemic on platform workers in the Ukraine doing kind of people who were on freelancing platforms. And we also did studies, we also did a study in the Philippines of virtual assistants. So virtual assistants are essentially secretaries located in the Philippines. In the study that we did, we found them working for Australian firms, working as a secretary, working set hours, 8 hours or 4 hours a day. They had to download software that tracked the work so that they could prove that they did their hours. But they were paid as an independent contractor. I mean, their contractual arrangement was as an independent contractor, and they basically had money sent into their bank accounts twice a month. So this move towards virtual outsourcing is problematic for the world's labor force because it means it's eroding the employment relationship. You have a risk that if a company right now has a worker, has an employee, they move to remote work during COVID, the person retires, the person quits. The company's going to reflect, should I hire this person as an employee or should I hire them as an independent contractor? Now, the problem here is that, of course, if somebody is being monitored, if they're actually having to work set hours and they're having to download some sort of software that tracks their work, that's very much an employment relationship. But then they're not making the contributions into the Social Security system. They don't have the labor protections, maternity protection, all the protections that come and that are central to the employment relationship. So this risk of employment misclassification is really heightened because of this move towards, let's say, permanent remote work or virtual outsourcing. And this is something that is highly problematic for achieving one of your recommendations, which is the social contract. If you don't have this contributory system, you don't have a social contract. Your social contract will break down. So this is something that really policymakers around the world need to be paying attention to. Other issues that we've seen with virtual outsourcing that are problematic is that a lot of the platforms that tend to be they're not always, sometimes the relationship is directly between the company and the worker, but usually they go first through a platform. They test out the worker, they find out that the worker works pretty well, and then they have a direct employment relationship with them. So we found that, for example, in our study of Ukraine, we did focus groups with 1,000 workers, and we found that 30% of them at one point had reported working directly with the client. So they tend to, eventually will work with the client. But in that period where they're working with the platform is charging a fee to the worker, and the worker is paying the fee, and that is actually the platform business model. So this is, again, highly problematic because not only do they not have the protections of the employment relationship, but they're paying a fee to do work. So this is really moving the world of work many years behind. So these are some things that I think we need to be thinking about, especially, at the ILO certainly needs to be thinking about it, but I think governments around the world need to be thinking about it because it questions the way we have been designing labor regulation. At the ILO, we pass international labor standards. Countries around our member states look at these international labor standards. They try to adopt their laws to be in conformity to them, and of course, enforce their laws within their national boundaries. But what we're seeing now is essentially a planetary labor market without a planetary system of labor market governance, and it's a very difficult issue to govern. There are some, we can perhaps talk in the discussion, some of the ideas for how we could govern this, but this is definitely, we have a lot of challenges ahead. And while it's fundamentally important for individual countries to be thinking about how they can protect their own workers, we need to be having also international discussions about this topic. So I'll stop here.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Just quickly to come back on that, you talked about the need for kind of a global approach and coordination around some of these employment issues involved with remote working. But we've seen global coordination on things like taxation, for example, can be really difficult and take a long time. That's time that Richard suggests we don't have. So is there anything, we're about to hear from Jonathan as a British politician, is there any advice you can give to domestic policymakers as to what they can be doing now kind of what's your number one thing, your quick bullet point on where domestic policymakers should focus now?
That's a good question, because I mean, you're absolutely right. To pass international regulation always takes a long time. So, one of the examples is seafarers, maritime workers. There's actually a very nice global regulation of seafaring that sets minimum standards, but it was decades for that to happen. And I think even for this labor market governance, it's going to be decades for it to happen. So in that respect, some of the policy recommendations that you make around the infrastructure, childcare, skills, those are also all really important things. Definitely the skill training, so that even if certain parts of the task of the job, the tasks are outsourced out, at least there are British workers who are doing kind of the more interactive work that needs to be done. So that's really certainly important. But I mean, I also wonder if there are some instruments, for example, the GDPR is interesting because it's a European-based regulation, but it has had repercussions on any companies working in the digital sphere because they have to abide by the GDPR. So those are things that are maybe, perhaps more immediate. But I think, the main issue in the short term is really to be aware of it, I think.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, we've heard international remote working, competition for international remote workers is here. It's happening now, and some of these technologies are disrupting our labor markets. How are you and how's the Labour Party thinking about these challenges?
Yeah, thank you very much for the chance to come along and speak this afternoon. I certainly agree with colleagues. This is a very timely, it's a very valuable piece of research. And what really struck me from reading it was really this analysis has been absent so far from some of the political debates that we've had in the UK. So we've been talking about how, the trends that we've seen in the pandemic, what do they mean for the future of city centres? We've talked about what do they mean for the traditional type of office. We've talked about what will it mean for this country if you could, for instance, do your job without going into London or Manchester or Leeds city centres. But interestingly, we've stopped the conversation there and not asked the bigger question, which is addressed in this report, which is, well, if you're looking at that trend, why necessarily would that trend simply be limited to work being distributed around your own country and not actually leave the UK altogether? And it's certainly true to say that the prospect of the UK losing what everyone would agree would be good graduate jobs, good jobs in sectors like software development, is frankly very alarming. I mean, the report makes a comparison to the deindustrialization of the 1980s. I mean, that's very much a personal story I can relate to. I grew up in the northeast of England at the end of coal mining and shipbuilding. And I would argue, to be honest, many of the contemporary problems in the UK stem from the UK not handling that period very well. And so the consequences can be significant. I think it is important to say we have had in the past, some predictions which haven't quite come true in the way people initially thought. I mean, I remember that initially when technology like broadband was just becoming something people were aware of, that there was a conversation about how place would become irrelevant, how, what we're talking about now would have been the case in the past. And actually what we've seen, I would say, is, cities and agglomeration have become the drivers of the type of jobs which are driving the economy in the UK and in comparable countries. But I mean, we certainly can't, however, just look at something like that and ignore this. I mean, even as a politician, the pandemic has completely changed how I have been able to work. I mean, people might say, well, the House of Commons is not a place known for its own innovation, and it's above time that we haven't had to walk through the division lobbies in person. But being able to beam into Parliament, to do a speech, to vote in that way, but most of all to be able to conduct meetings around the country and with any stakeholder or expert in a really accessible way. I mean, that has genuinely been quite transformative. And we've seen, a decade ago, I was a trainee solicitor in Manchester, and we used to, for instance, not do our own document processing. All that was uploaded to a software system, and it was done in South Africa, I think, overnight. And I used to think at the time, well, how long will it be till the solicitor bit of this is the bit that is done abroad as well? So, we have to be aware of this. Janine is right. This has to be something that policymakers are very much aware of. But what I really wanted to say in these opening remarks are, maybe I'm a relentless optimist, but I do take a positive view. I think there is far too much in the political debate in the UK around the economy, which is nostalgic, I think, which, you tend to remember the good things of what you've had in the past and not necessarily the bad things that came with that too. But also I believe social and economic change can work for the UK. It can work for the Labour Party and parties of the left. That's part of the analysis as well. But I'm interested in the question of how can we make that work? How do you turn something like this that we should be, alert to, worried about, yes, but how can you turn that into an opportunity? And there are two things that are in the report that I would certainly agree with. First of all, a relentless focus on skills, and I want to say something about that. But I also want to talk about what we've learned in terms of the pandemic and the social security safety net, which I think is important to allow people to handle change of this kind. So briefly, first of all, on skills, we talk in the Labour Party about the requirement for a new settlement for working people. And we like that phrase that Joe Biden has publicised about jobs that you can raise a family on. And of course, that's fundamentally a question about wages, about decent wages that you can do that on. But I think it's also a question about power in the workplace, about how you are able to request that kind of flexibility, how you can combine work with caring responsibilities, as well as the wages that you need. And also how you can combine work with opportunities to fulfill your potential. Everyone should, our aspiration should be for every type of work to be one you can grow in, develop in, progress in. And often there's a joke in the UK that, politicians like to be photographed with high-vis vests on in some sort of cutting-edge, climate-focused job of the future. Actually, there's a bigger question in the UK as to how you provide that kind of opportunity to all forms of work. And actually, what's interesting right now, we have a meeting as Labour politicians with the big employment organisations, employees organisations every fortnight. The big question that they're coming to us with is about skills shortages. And the question of how we improve our domestic skills base to compete is the first one I would say is central to understanding in order to respond well to this. And I think already I look at this pandemic and I feel that we've missed some opportunities already. I mean, the decade we had going into the pandemic in the UK was one of austerity, big cuts to areas like further education, which I would argue are crucial to getting this right. But also, if you look at the schemes that have been adopted specifically to respond to the pandemic, the Kickstart scheme, the program for younger workers who are in need of intervention to get back in the labour market, I mean, that is effectively now just a wage subsidy. There is no training opportunity that comes with that. It doesn't link to any sense of national priorities, whether that's climate change or social care or the health service, which are all particularly relevant to the pandemic. And actually, we haven't even engaged with the possibility that the furlough scheme offered us to retrain workers, to offer them opportunities. That's simply not been part of the conversation either, despite the fact that relatively large resources are being put into this, the combination of Restart and Kickstart in my department, which I shadow, over £4.5 billion allocated to that. And the Restart scheme, which hasn't begun yet, it's aimed at the long-term unemployed in the UK. Again, that doesn't appear to have learned any of the mistakes of those earlier schemes either, and that is a real missed opportunity. I always say politicians cannot predict the sectors of the future. Yes, we know there are things that as a country we have to tackle, so retrofitting our housing stock is a good example people give, electric vehicle infrastructure is part of that. But they're not the entirety of the solution. The real solution is how do you build an infrastructure that gives people the real avenues they need to be able to constantly adapt, to equip British workers with the ability to learn and respond to that, to have that flexibility. There'll be, frankly, jobs and sectors which we don't even know how to describe, which will become available. But what we can say in the UK is we don't have that system in place at present. And frankly, we aren't learning enough from the kind of interventions we've already made as to how to get that right. The second thing that I want to get onto is about that social security system that would allow people to do that. I mean, this is an area of real failure in the UK. The fact that 1 in 8 British workers is technically in poverty, based on the definitions that are the widely agreed definitions of poverty in the UK, is not only economically and morally wrong. To me, it's literally, it's a huge missed opportunity. Because frankly, if you are living in housing that isn't suitable, if your work is heavily limited by your childcare options, if you haven't got the kind of opportunities to get the skills that you need, the idea that you can compete in this competitive global environment is clearly just not a possibility whatsoever. And if you look at how the UK has tried and been able to respond to the pandemic, frankly, what you see is a social security system which had to be completely adapted on the eve of the crisis to respond to the kind of need that we had. It's not a system, frankly, that can respond to the kind of shocks that we're talking about in this report. It's been heavily shaped by the politics of the UK and a perception that the problem in the UK is the need essentially to cajole people into employment at the lower end of the labour market, into lower paid jobs. But that is simply not true. I would argue you can only compete in this new world of work if you have the right system of support for people alongside that. And we've created on the eve of this crisis entire new schemes of government support. The furlough scheme, frankly, is a really good example of that. Moving to a sort of wage insurance model that's more common on the continent, which we've never had here. And yet, if we hadn't had that, for most people, the support they would have received is simply the national insurance-based part of our welfare state, which is £73 a week. I mean, it's completely inadequate. And we've got to learn from that, frankly. If we're interested in how we can really adequately respond to these kind of shocks and these kinds of changes, we've got to admit that at present simply that is just not a part of the conversation in the UK. And I would argue very much that it needs to be. I'd also say that if you look at what really anchors jobs in communities like mine, like I represent on the east side of Greater Manchester, in terms of the schools, the family networks, adequate housing, well, actually, those are things that make life more enjoyable and more fulfilled as well. And actually, I would argue that part of the conversation of a fairer, more productive economy is also the same conversation that we need in terms of responding to the risks that are in this report. The final thing I want to say is really, if I look at how businesses and workers have adapted, in many cases, incredibly quickly to lockdown and to the challenges of the pandemic in terms of, yes, the acceleration of digital technology and so forth, I don't feel, frankly, that the government of the UK has responded as nimbly as many of our businesses and many of our workers themselves have had to do. So I'm optimistic about the future, but I recognise that if we're going to respond adequately to it, it can't happen by accident. It requires active, responsible government that is prepared to understand these risks and properly respond to them. And really, to summarise, I would say this is clearly an incredibly important issue and incredibly important research. But I don't want us to be depressed or fatalistic about our response to it, but I certainly recognise, frankly, we will need to do something different in the UK to what we've been doing for much of the last decade to mitigate that risk. And I think there's opportunities there as well as threats, and that's exactly what people like me, I think, have to respond to.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, we've got some good questions coming in from the attendees. So I'm going to move over to ask a couple of these questions. First, I will pick up the one from Andrew Farrand. Apologies if I've got that wrong. And it's a question for all the panelists, and kind of touches on something that both Johnny and Richard mentioned, which is kind of among the potential anchors that might limit offshoring and service sector jobs are cultural factors, community factors. Do you believe that these cultural and kind of social and community differences will substantially limit the pace of virtual outsourcing, as Janine calls it, or will companies find technical and organizational workarounds to overcome these obstacles? Happy to open it up. Richard, Janine, Johnny, anybody want to take that first? Richard, shall we come to you first?
Sure. So yes, culture super matters. A lot of these calculations, which were done based on COVID things and the design of jobs that were before COVID, are more or less assuming that it's the same worker doing the same job, but just somewhere else. So then the issue is that technically possible or feasible? And there's a few things to look through. But much of jobs have to do with how important is the interaction, the cultural understanding, the trust. And so there are many, many jobs, or I should say at least many tasks in jobs that can't be offshored to people far away. Now, there are people in England who are willing to work for less, and because they have lower costs of living, and so they have the same culture. So this idea of it moving off into the regions is less governed by that. But when you actually then take it and move it to the Ukraine or Manila or India or Colombia or whatever it is, culture becomes a big issue. But on the other hand, as you've tried to pick that up in the report, is that if you focus on tasks where that kind of trust, where the local knowledge, the cultural knowledge, the linguistic capacity isn't important, those tasks will move, and that will change everybody's jobs. So I don't really view cultural as locking in many jobs. There's of course some occupations that aren't going to move, but many what we really have to look at is the task. So this sort of cultural thing. And like in my book, when you project it way far forward, basically everything that can be done remotely will be done remotely, because the price difference is like 15 or 10 to 15 times cheaper over there. And so the jobs that are left will require local human interactions. So I think the nature of the jobs will evolve so that we do need to actually be there and understand the people we're with or the customers we're with. So it's the nature of the jobs which will be moving. And the lesson is that you really should be, it's in your report, you have to move towards more soft skills. And this idea that we need more STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, those are the easiest things to offshore. So I think a lot of the last thinking, that was the industrial thinking. But so anyways, culture is super important, and it is what will save it. So let me give you an example. So there's in Switzerland, we have a very bizarre form of German. And people speak this German, and they trust people who speak with the same German. And so lots of the call centers for Swiss Air, for example, are still manned by Swiss people, because they won't talk to people with Filipino accents and things like that. So that's just an example. But anyways, I agree with the question. Culture is important, local is important.
Janine or
yeah, so I actually had a call center example as well, but it was slightly different. And it was to say, okay, so part of me does think that culture can be a buffer, and especially for things that have to deal with interactions, especially in the workplace, not so much with customers, but in the workplace. Languages also can be a buffer, but for the UK, that doesn't help, because unfortunately, English is the international language, and there's a lot of people in the world that speak English. But there's a lot of things that we would have thought culture would be an impediment, such as all the customer service jobs that all of us know very well. When we call other airlines, we are getting people in different parts of the world. So I think it's not as much of a buffer. And I think with globalization, a lot of these cultural differences are being flattened as well. So I don't think that that's something that can be relied upon.
Johnny, thank you.
It's a fascinating question. It really is. And I agree with Richard that culture is really important. Everyone appears to need a call center example. So I say sometimes when I ring a UK-based call center, I can tell if the person on the other end is basically has the same accent as the place I grew up in the northeast of England, which I'm told is a favourite for companies to base their call centers there, because people like, for some reason, that particular type or British accent. But I think it feels to me that it would be too much of a risk to believe that will be a sufficient buffer in itself. And that's why I think for me, the fundamental drivers are about skills and quality. I think where there's been a problem in the past, in some instances for, say, the outsourcing of call centers, hasn't been a cultural problem. It's that the quality of the product hasn't matched what people have needed, customers have needed when they have used that. So for me, the focus has to be skills and quality. And notwithstanding the very real economics of the price differential that Richard's mentioned, to me, I look at it and think, well, could we in the UK offer the kind of quality with the advantages we have in terms of time zone, common law, and so forth, that would bring work here? I mean, you can't ignore the kind of economic differential in wages that we're talking about in a report like this, but we've got to look at it in that way. So culture, again, fascinating question, very important, but I think not sufficient in itself.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question from Christina Palmer, because it speaks to something that we are discussing it within the Institute as well. Is, we have colleagues in the Institute who work with developing countries, and they're very much looking at the opportunity of remote work as, this is a unique opportunity for their citizens to work remotely in their country and taking well-paid jobs from elsewhere in the world without having to move abroad. Opportunity is no longer being limited by geography, but in some ways dictated by connectivity, as my fantastic colleague Sophie Dolstrup puts it. So, to Christina's question here is, should we as the UK, or should countries try to compete for these anywhere jobs, or even the tasks within these jobs, as Richard has said? Or should the focus be on training individuals to have the skills relevant for tasks or jobs that won't be moved abroad or are less vulnerable? And maybe to Johnny in particular, do you think the UK skills system, how would you change the UK skill system specifically to give people those skills? I'll open it up there. Richard, you want to jump in first?
Yeah. So just on that, this is globalization, and globalization is always and always has been more opportunities for the most competitive workers and more competition for the least competitive workers. And one thing we know is the UK has a comparative advantage in services, high income services. People are paid a lot of money in London, and they're in London for a very good reason, because it's competitive and there's a cluster thing and an aggregation thing. So I very much agree with what Jonathan had said at the end, is this is an opportunity, just exactly as outsourcing labor-intensive stages of manufacturing help keep more manufacturing in Japan and in Germany than it otherwise would have happened. This idea that you can offshore the stuff you're not good at, focus on the things you are good at, I think is something to look at. This is not just fearful, and especially in the UK, because of English, the culture, the openness, the flexibility, the innovation, the things that have made the UK's service sector a world-beating export factor. In principle, offshoring the stuff where the UK doesn't have a competitive advantage may make it more competitive. So I very much agree with that idea that it's an opportunity as well as a threat. But now, of course, it's going to involve a massive movement, just like all the other globalizations did. So the government's job is to help make sure that people participating in this pains and the gains. But there's no doubt, for instance, for me and Janine, we're exporting way more than we did before because of these remote things. So if you're doing well, if you're competitive internationally, remote means you're more popular than you were before, or more opportunities than were you before. And I do think that you've got to look at both sides. It's not just a fearful thing, it's also a hopeful thing. And if you look, for example, Silicon Valley's secret is Indian coders. That's how they turn around these apps so quickly and engage them. It's not being done in California, but they know how to organize and operationalize this network of people to do and deliver a great product. And that allows them to live in Palo Alto with ridiculous housing prices, very high salaries, and it's still worthwhile because they've been making these as tools. It's like machinery that makes them more effective. So you got me started on one of my favorites, but I'll stop right there.
We'll come to Janine. Is there more international competition, or are you more internationally popular because of remote work?
I mean, okay. So in answer to that question, I was going to say that I think you need to be investing in the skills anyway, whether they're going to be for the local market or whether they're going to be for the international market. And I don't think a government can say, okay, we're going to specifically focus on this, or maybe a poor developing country could, but I don't think in the UK sense it would make sense to pivot to one or the other, but to rather to have more of a holistic approach to just developing the skills that are necessary that can make you both competitive locally and competitive internationally. So that would be my answer for that issue. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay. Johnny, any comments on the UK skill system and what needs to happen to kind of make it fit for purpose for this new remote world?
I'll answer all of the questions that came in. I mean, the first thing to say is I think you can't resist economic change. I mean, the idea that we could just not engage with this and think we could keep certain things and other things would go to other parts of the world. I mean, the lesson is if you don't prepare for these things, you don't understand these things, they will affect you, whether you believe you could avoid that change or not. And I think what is interesting is to get it right. Richard made some points there about the things that we're good at as a country in the UK and where our strengths lie. I think you've got to understand that as a country. I mean, there is nobody in the UK wants to get back into the Brexit debate. It's done and dusted. But what was interesting about that is maybe as a country, we didn't approach that in a way that asks the question, what are we good at as a country and what do we like about that? And how could we make this work for ourselves? We've essentially got a future trade agreement with the European Union that is very poor on services, despite that being a national strength, and is pretty good on goods in the main, even though, that is something that will favour the European Union, which exports large amounts of goods to the UK. And so I think it's an interesting question. Are nations aware of what they're good at? Are we as a country aware of what we're good at? And are we comfortable with that? Because I made the point in the introduction about how sort of nostalgia in British politics. I mean, there is certainly nostalgia for the heydays of British manufacturing in the 1950s, when it was a much bigger proportion of GDP. A balance could be better in the UK, but there are many things that debate misses. For instance, the former parts of the what was once the British Empire, understandably not wanting to simply be export markets for the UK, and lots of things around what we used to count as manufacturing, is now broken up and much more competitive, and that means we don't have ICI that used to do everything and count it towards that part of the national economy. So we've got to understand what we're good at. Specifically on skills, I'll get myself into a little bit of trouble if I infringe on the education side of the Shadow Cabinet. But for me, in the working pension side, the question is specifically about how, if we all recognise the British economy, people need more resilience, they need more security in the workplace. We've got some big problems around how we tackle, for instance, the change in a much bigger focus on self-employment in the UK, and how we've done some very good things in the UK around the coverage of occupational pensions in the private sector, but not the adequacy of them. How do you combine all of that into something which copes with people changing careers, which copes with them facing the kind of shocks which certain sectors wouldn't have had to experience to the same degree in the past? And I think that can be done. Actually, there are things like, for instance, the UK pension system, which is essentially based on a substantial state pension, with the assumption you'll need your own private occupational provision alongside that. I look at retirement ages and think, why couldn't you have a degree of flexibility within that, rather than the binary, working age and retirement age as traditionally has been the case? So I think there are opportunities there. It is not easy, I recognise that, but I think, to go back to the start of the question, it couldn't be the case that policymakers in any country could just say, look, we're going to have to exit some sectors, or believe we can resist that power of change in certain parts of the economy, because the lesson is it will come at you whether you prepare for it or acknowledge it or not.
Jeegar, can I jump in on that point there about changing jobs? I think one thing that's very clear about this digital technology, apart from anywhere jobs, is it means that people will change jobs more quickly than they did before, more frequently. And that's been a kind of a general trend, where people would change jobs maybe once or twice in a career. Now it's like 8 times, I think, on average, and it will accelerate. So the ability of governments to provide policies which help people switch jobs is becoming more and more important. And the second point is that when we look backwards, we were talking about globalization affecting, 10, 15% of the workforce who are in manufacturing, and a bit of mining and stuff, and agriculture, but mostly manufacturing. This is 80%, 85% of the workforce in the service sector who will start to have to change jobs even more frequently. They've already seen that, but this is going to accelerate it. And so I think that's that idea that the main thing we have to do is get people to move between jobs more easily, and make sure that they don't have too much uncertainty in their life in the meantime. That's a big goal of government. Whether or not you resist it or you retrain them, whatever, no matter what, people are going to have to be changing jobs more. So we need more of the support for that.
Great. We're coming down to the last few minutes. So I'll ask one last question, combine a couple different questions from the feed. Look, we're getting to a world where labor is becoming more like capital. It's becoming far more mobile, far more global, and far more 24 hours a day. How do you protect workers and encourage dynamism and make sustained dynamism in that type of economy without enabling exploitation of workers or resorting to kind of nationalist, interventionist, protectionist measures? Is there something we could learn from the efforts to regulate labor and ethical standards and manufacturing value chains over the past 30, 40 years that can, be relevant to the kind of these remote jobs in the future? Any last comments or thoughts on that? Johnny?
I would just briefly say, you should need to start with designing policy around the reality we're describing. I mean, if I look at the department that I shadow, we've had really sort of 10 years in the UK of rhetoric, assuming there's a group of people who don't work and the welfare system should be quite mean to them, and a group of people who fund that. Now, what we're talking about here, Janine and Richard are quite right to say people changing jobs and you having to respond to challenges. That's the reality. And actually, if you start off, whether it's political purposes or simply because you're nostalgic and out of date with the problem you're analysing, with designing these policies for a reality that no longer exists, sort of the traditional post-war 9-to-5 employment pattern, then you're going to get it wrong. And I think that is incredibly important for people to understand, because actually it's quite exciting to think about the innovation that could be there, that could be necessary when you start diagnosing the real problem and coming up with solutions to it. A report like this, I do lots of sessions around think tanks producing work and that sort of thing. This is what I can honestly say, it really makes you think about what is the policy response to this that might even consider getting it right. It's incredibly thought-provoking, but I think, as I say, it can be an optimistic one as well as one that has some alarming trends to it as well.
Janine, any last comments or thoughts?
I mean, I think for the really highly skilled worker, there aren't too many concerns here. That person can jump around to better employers and they can bargain and they can have good working conditions. Even if they're classified as an independent contractor, they have enough income that they can self-insure themselves, so they're okay. My concern is more the middle level workers. So the low skilled wouldn't be really been doing this type of work, but the middle level would be. And they're really, at the Upwork platform, for example, I looked at data from 2019. Over 2 million people were registered on the platform. Only 8% had earned more than $1. So you have a huge global competition that can lead to a race to the bottom. Mm-hmm. So I do think there needs to be some sort of minimum standards. And there also be, not just, minimum wages and those sorts of protections would be important, but even just basic protections to ensure that if you're working virtually for some company located in a different country and they don't pay you, where do you go? So we need to have some sort of governance systems in place that minimally protect workers and then maybe build up from there. And as I said earlier, that's a longer term project.
Brilliant. Richard, 30 seconds for the last word.
No, so I was hoping Janine would answer that question about the ones we need, but I think, basically our social contract is based on an employment contract, and that is disappearing. And we need to shift the social bargain to something that's more like they have in Denmark, where it's hire fire as you want, but the state makes sure that you will find another job and does whatever is necessary. And the confidence that everybody has that will happen gives the economy a flexibility that goes ahead. Now, Denmark's an unusual situation, but I think that is the key, to de-link employment and social benefits in a way that it makes the entire economy more flexible and people more sure about their future and therefore willing to invest in all sorts of things, giving tries. So to me, it's a general thing of redesigning the whole social contract away from employment.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. And I think we can draw it to a close. I've really enjoyed this discussion about how the future of work is becoming more digital and more global. And to paraphrase or steal a quote from Richard's book, the response has to be to make work more human and more local. Thank you, everybody, and we'll look forward to carrying on this conversation.